Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be speaking to you from the museum, from WCMA, as we're continuing to install Remixing the Hall. I am standing between, on my left, an adoration of the shepherds by makers that we have not yet identified from Spain. From about the 16th century, and on my right is a painting by Amina Robinson, which will be discussed later by Elizabeth Sandoval. But I thought it was important to be in the galleries to sort of give an idea of scale and also sort of to introduce what we're trying to do here. So I think the real word for this exhibition is collaborative. We came together as three curators with different areas of expertise and different interests, academic interests, but we also were thinking about how objects themselves can collaborate together, objects from different periods, different time places, different contexts, to themselves come together in juxtapositions to create meaning, and to create meaning that is sort of larger than maybe each individual object. This exhibition follows to a certain extent in a sort of long-standing academic museum tradition of doing, of mixing works from different places and different time periods. And that has to do with a lot with our mission as teaching support for Williams College, but it also is deeply ingrained in the kind of tradition of the liberal arts. So we started from a kind of premise that we were going to be doing an exhibition that really was mining as deeply as we could the entire collection of 15,000 objects, thereabouts, that we have at WCMA. And we gave ourselves this sort of this permission, or this kind of mandate to sort of deeply dive into everything at the museum. Nothing was off limits for this exhibition, and I think we hopefully, when we're all installed and everyone can come and see it, that will pay off in terms of how you're experiencing and how you are maybe thinking differently about things that you maybe have seen here before, but also that you probably haven't, which I'll get to a little bit later. We started this in 2019 and had just begun the process of thinking about the checklist when the museum closed in March of 2020. So most of what we were doing was through images. We began with an idea that we would sort of be looking at data that the museum has been sort of trying to produce over the past couple of years. One of the things that we thought was important was to think about the proportion of different kinds of objects, different media, different time periods, and different places. And we wanted to sort of try to get a representative sample, if you will, from those different sort of proportions that we have in the collections. So that really helped us. So being able to have that data of how many African objects do we have, how many Greek and Roman objects do we have, et cetera. That was really helpful. Then we were working mostly from images because we weren't able to come to the museum. We weren't able to access the object files. And I think that worked really well in terms of how we were thinking formally about works in the collection and how those works really sort of helped inform the themes that Elizabeth and Horace will be talking about later. But it also led to some interesting juxtapositions when we got into the galleries with the objects in the past week or so, where some things were a lot smaller than we sort of imagined, and some things were a lot bigger than we imagined. I think it's actually much richer and much more interesting kind of for that. We were working together in a very non-hierarchical way. Each one of the three of us was mining the collections. We were coming together every Friday to have these really wonderful discussions, fulsome discussions about different kinds of objects and about how they played with others. And that's kind of how we ended up developing the checklist. Many of the objects were things that were known to us and were in our areas of scholarly expertise. but a lot of them were very much outside of our academic specialties, which also sort of led to thinking very much, again, sort of formally about objects. And I think that, that sort of, it also, I think, led us to certain things that, that if we were subject areas and expert, we might not have shown, maybe, or wouldn't have thought about in the same way. While all of that work was ongoing in 2020, not only were we thinking about COVID and its impact on the world and on museums and on colleges and on people, but we were also thinking about the uprisings that were happening throughout the country in response to police extrajudicial murder of Black people. And we were thinking about what does that, what can a museum do? What can we do to sort of to reckon with our current and our past histories? We're in a building. The Remixing the Hall title refers to Lawrence Hall. Lawrence Hall was built with the proceeds of enslaved Black labor. Amos Lawrence made all of his money in the cotton trade. We're also, as Nina mentioned in the land acknowledgement, on Mohican land, stolen Mohican land, and the college's founder, Ephraim Williams, was an active participant in Indigenous American genocide. So those are all also things that we were thinking about. The collection itself, particularly those objects that came in early, were the product of alumni who went out and were part of the sort of colonial enterprise in the 19th century. And also things were coming back from alumni who were missionaries. And so there are lots of objects that we're very much invested in kind of investigating the provenance of. So we really wanted to sort of, those are a lot of kind of things to keep up in the air. But we really, our watchword was kind of reckoning. We're at a moment of reckoning, both I think as a nation, as a world, and as museums and academic institutions. So all of that kind of came into play. And one of the things and I think I've alluded to it in terms of how we were working, but one of the other things that led to was us thinking very non-hierarchically about objects. So we give the same amount of kind of interpretive care to something that is a fragment, something that is an inch tall, and similarly to a really spectacular contemporary work, our collection of Italian and Baroque panel paintings, our collection of American paintings. So we were trying to kind of think about a leveling of all of that, and I think for us, every object in the collection is interesting and has something interesting to say. It's up to us to kind of really be thinking about how to do that. So that was sort of how we were also kind of thinking about this being, it's not a highlights exhibition, it's really an exhibition that kind of shows a sample of the collection where everything is treated very, there are no hierarchies of genre here. Painting is not, supreme, with sculpture next, and then decorative arts kind of at the bottom. And yeah, so we were really kind of, I think that was our organizing principle. We were really working collectively and collaboratively, and trying to sort of give us our own individual voices, our voices as a collective, and we were trying to think about how the objects came together in a similar way to sort of help translate each other and to help sort of create meaning that's greater maybe than the individual object. I will now turn it over to my colleagues Elizabeth Sandoval and Horace Ballard, who will discuss more in depth some of the themes of the exhibition.
I'll introduce myself first. So hello, I'm Elizabeth. I'm the curatorial assistant, and I'm very excited for you all to see the installation. We're hoping that you see the themes that we found in the artworks, which came out of the artworks, as jumping off points for your own contemplation when you're in the galleries, as you find connections between the works. So some of the themes that emerge are that of transcendence, or moving from one state to another, such as an earthly one to a divine one. We also see artworks speak to each other across time and space. So newer artworks are responding to older traditions. In addition, many works visualize power and its absence through the representation of certain figures or gestures or objects and more. I will pass it on to Horace to continue to describe more themes.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you all for joining us. As Kevin said, we were reckoning as individuals and as colleagues and as individuals who are part of a larger team of colleagues within an incredible intellectual community about the place of the world and about the transitory nature, the temporality of the world during COVID, during racial unrest. And so temporality came out to be one of our themes, and we can speak more about that with objects. We're also thinking through really important critical theory that's pushing us toward a broadening of understanding trans identity and thinking more about transitioning trans life diachronically in the ancient world as well as in the contemporary moment, and the broader category of hybridity. Can we understand our current conversation around trans identities to go beyond the bodily and go to the geographic, the land, to go to the ways that communities have interfaced between and against and around each other? So that was the theme. And then we kind of thought about this broader understanding of water. Kevin wrote a beautiful reflection in the exhibition about Edmund Burke and the sublime and the kind of infinitesimal expanse of water that was both the vehicle and the technology for colonial trauma, as well as Christina Sharp's incredible rumination of being in the wake of water and the ways in which that trauma of colonial violence also brought chattel slavery and what it means to live with those resonances. And so reflecting deeply about instances of water in the collection. I just also want to say, as many of you have, as thoughts have been percolating, to please put them in the chat. And we're going to turn to some of those questions now, but please continue to unravel them and to work through them across the next few moments. And if we don't get to them at this moment, hopefully we'll be able to have some time to engage them at the end along with you. And now we'll turn it to you.
Hi, everyone. Horace, Elizabeth, Kevin, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction to the process so far. And yes, please, to my wonderful people in the audience, please do drop your questions into the Zoom navigation bar. As we're waiting for folks to share their thoughts with us, I wanted to ask a little bit about the title of the show and dig a little bit more into that. I think, Kevin, you spoke so beautifully about the choice to that first part of the title, Remixing the Hall, and the allusion to the history of the museum's building, Lawrence Hall. The other part of the title is Collection in Perpetual Transition. And I wondered if the three of you might talk a little bit about the kind of iterative process of engaging with our collections, what that's looked like, up until this point, and perhaps also thinking about what this might look like as we move forward in future engagement with our collections.
I'm happy to start. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Thank you, sir. I was just going to say that this sort of the idea of perpetual is there's a couple of, I think, meanings of that. One is we are an institution which collects as voraciously as we can. So we are an exhibition. We're an institution that both buys and solicits gifts from generous donors. So that means that there's always the collection, the context for the collection. It changes every year, changes every couple of months. Every time we get a new object, our collection, the meaning of our greater collection kind of changes, and that I think we need to reckon and respond to those things as well. And some of that we can shape, some of it we have less power to shape. but that's part of this idea of transition and perpetual transition. You know, we're not a locked collection, and I think that the other part of that is, again, just the sort of, but both Horace and I brought up, is this idea of, you know, we're constantly having to reckon with the collection. You know, we have areas of the collection that came in, you know, with very little provenance. We are right now actively engaged in working on NAGPRA. So we're working with the few Indigenous American objects that are in the collection, and trying to reach out to the communities from which those came. So that's something that's work that is also ongoing, and we're going to turn. We're turning our sort of we're turning that kind of idea of thinking about community, thinking about where objects maybe don't belong here anymore, and because they weren't ours to begin with. So I think there's both things coming in that change the collection, but then there are things that are, you know, rightfully going out that are changing the collection. So that to me, that's the sort of the broader context of kind of transition. And Elizabeth, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, Nina, for that beautiful question. I'll say that when we started, I believe that we came up with in our first iterations with 150 objects. And then Horace invited us to stop and to contemplate and to lessen our list so that we could really invite viewers to look closely at these objects and to think very closely about the dialogues that they have in the galleries. Because we know that we will continually create new reinstallations of the collection.
Beautiful. Horace, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Just, I have such wonderful colleagues, and they have said what I was going to say, and something we also thought about as the world was in transition, as people were in transition, is that every generation of students and scholars and curators will tell different stories about the collection. And as people are in transition, so is technology in transition. And as technology changes, we'll know more about some of these objects that we know before, and that data will allow us to tell new stories about the way the world has always been connected, and that was a part of our thinking too.
That's wonderful. Thank you all so much for that. We also had a question that I was happy to see about label text and about your approach and to the label text in the exhibition. I know you've all spoken so much about many of the themes that you're reckoning with, and the question here was wondering whether, you know, some of those things are surfacing in the text that you have in the exhibition. So I'd love to share a little bit about that with our audiences too.
I would say just absolutely. It is everything from asking many more questions than we perhaps have done in the past on our labels, to being very clear, explicit about what is known. And also something that the wonderful Elizabeth inspired us to do is to really think through not just where an object was made or the life and transition dates of a maker, should we know that maker, but also what was the name of the place to the inhabitants of a place when that object was made, and how has that changed? And so some of the labels are quite lengthy, and it was called this by its people, and then was colonized and called this, and now present day we might refer to it as this, so that even the place names and the people names and the cultural groups are as much in transition as our own knowledge.
And I think that also speaks to, you know, this idea of transition, and not only just sort of transition of the collection and how we might interpret it, but also sort of transition over long time, right? Because it indicates that, you know, that the kind of nation states that we all sort of inhabit now, that was not, you know, that's an invention, that's really a colonial, right, invention. And it doesn't go back further than the 16th, 15th, 16th centuries, right? So it's not, and it's mostly, and a lot of it is really Western. So by adding all of the place names and being very specific about what places were called when artists were there, I think hopefully one of the big takeaways is that we are inhabiting one moment, and as Horace very eloquently said, the people that come after us will be interpreting things differently. We'll be bringing different objects in the collection. We'll be bringing different eyes and expertise to bear. And so I think that having that fulsome description of where an artist was born, studied, lived, worked, and died, I think hopefully we'll sort of get that across as well.
I'll just add briefly that I cannot take credit for the idea. It was absolutely collaborative. But thank you, Chris.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much for that. We have, I think, one more question we'll answer now. And I do just want to say to our audience that we will do some more Q&A at the very end of the program. So there'll be certainly more wonderful content to share that we'll hear from our wonderful curators about in the second half of the program, and I'm sure more questions to come. But we do have one other question I'd love to address now. We have an attendee asking if you could speak a bit about how you conceived of the different geographies in the exhibition. Was it a challenge to curate globally? Did anything surprising arise? They wanted to just hear more about all of that. And I think that flows beautifully from some of the things you've already shared thus far.
I'll start by saying that Horace started us off by having us look at the collection, and we tallied, where do we have these objects? Where are they coming from? How many from these areas, and also their media? And that was a wonderful way to comprehensively not only look at the collection, but see how we could install different artworks together.
But yeah, some of it was challenging. It's one of those. I mean, I think it's one of the great things about working at WCMA is that although we do have titles that sometimes suggest that we are sort of curators of different areas of the collection, that's not how we work here in terms of the curatorial and really engagement team. I think that everybody feels as though none of the collections are siloed, and we can work with anything that we really want to. But I think, as I mentioned in the introduction, we couldn't get to object files because we literally couldn't enter the museum for almost a year, and so it was so we had to really be thinking a lot about about sort of what we could know about an object without having that specific object information, but also we were really thinking about, again, formal properties and thinking about how formal properties could come together, and we also, I think, wanted to I think we were all interested in having an exhibition that the objects tell a lot of that story. The objects carry a lot of the meaning versus text. So right now in the exhibition, we have panels that explain the broad themes that Elizabeth and Horace outlined, and then we have what in the museum world is called a tombstone, which gives the object information, and then the fulsome description of where an artist lived, worked, and died, and as much information about the artist makers that we can. But we're also very honest about where we don't know who the maker is, and that is work that, and we signal that is work that is also very much ongoing. That's perpetual work, again, of trying to sort of to figure out certain things about the objects that we don't know. And in fact, when the public comes streaming back into the building soon, it may be that they help inform us about some of the things that we know less about.
I so love that, Kevin, and I would just love to kind of bring the audience into something that we were talking about, and I'm thinking particularly of a moment during those Friday conversations in July when we were all in different places in the country. I know that I was sitting in Virginia, and you reminded us, Kevin, that as curators and as art historians, we all are trained in, say, a primary field, but we took classes across the history of art, right? And also across literature and in languages. And so in many ways, coming to the fulsomeness of the collection allowed us to come to the fulsomeness of ourselves. And Elizabeth started talking about photography, and I went back into like my ancient roots, right? And it was just like, what are the things in the collection that just make me so happy and that I don't know enough to be an expert, not at all. And what even does that word expertise mean? But I know enough to potentially ask a really interesting question to spur conversation. And that was really, I think, exciting as well.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad. I think Kevin and what you said and Horace, what you just said, I mean, about the importance of and the challenges of having to rely on close looking as a method and the ways in which that has really expanded. I think the ways in which you think about expertise, I love all of that. And I think that's a wonderful transition to the second half of this program, where we are going to hear a little more from Elizabeth and Horace about close looking at some of the works in the show. So I'd love to turn it over to you, and then Kevin's going to rejoin us at the end, and we will do another Q&A before wrapping up. So as you have questions for our fantastic curators, please do share those. And yeah, with that, I think we'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Nina, Horace, and Kevin. So we'll view works in relation to our themes. We'll start with some representational ones, and we'll move to the ones that are less representational. We'll start with Amina Robinson's "Oh Mary, Don't You Weep." We see here a woman who looks weary. Her eyes are watery, her fingers are clenched, and she's looking out into the distance. Let's notice that there's writing to the left of her face in the work. Next slide, please, Annie. That says, "Oh Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. One of this mornings at 5 o'clock, the whole world is gonna reel and rock. Pharaoh's army got debunked. Oh Mary, don't you weep." So these are words that, lyrics from an African-American spiritual that emerged at the time of slavery and would reemerge as it was needed throughout time. And as we know, it continues to be needed. There are also other titles from other spirituals. There is one that contours her hand that says, "We be going to downriver," and another one that says, "I've been booped by her foot, by her left foot." Thank you to Brian Repetto for helping me to make that one out. But we're going to focus on "Oh Mary, Don't You Weep," which refers to when the ancient Egyptians, were held as slaves by, the ancient Jews were held as slaves by the Egyptian pharaohs, but they survived. They were saved by God. Slaves would sing about this because it would bring them hope that they would also come to freedom. In fact, the slavery has been referred to as another Exodus, and the Exodus was described in the Bible. So who can this Mary be? There are several options, but we're going to consider the Virgin Mary, who is described, her life is described in the New Testament, the second part of the Christian Bible. And earlier stories, like the Exodus, were used as foreshadowings of what happens in the newer texts. So who is the Virgin Mary? Well, she was a very poor Jewish girl who rose to become a divine figure because she was believed to have birthed Christ, an incarnation of God. And here we see a very humble woman. She has no feet. No shoes. She does have feet, and there's nothing in her basket. So just as Amina Robinson is looking at old African-American spirituals, she's probably also considering art historical iconography or symbols. So next slide, please, Annie. This is an image of the Annunciation. We see here on the right, Mary is reading when Angel Gabriel comes and appears before her and tells her that she has found grace with God. And we see God the Father in the top left, and he has a baby Jesus, a little baby, who is about to impregnate Mary and to be birthed later by her. This is a moment of transcendence, if there ever was one, right? This is a moment when the heavenly and the earthly realms meet. Now you see in the lower right-hand corner of the painting on the right that Mary has a basket with cloth, and there even is a pair of silver scissors. So apocryphal tales or very old legends say that Mary was weaving the veil of the Temple of Jerusalem when the angel appeared to her. So Amina Robinson may have been considering that iconography when she included a basket. But obviously there are very different representations. And both of these representations, we're looking at older representations of goddess figures, of divine figures who were also mothers. So next slide, please. Thank you. Notice how Robinson has included in her image, we can see the breast revealed through the green dress and even her nipple, perhaps to reflect motherhood. And here we have to the right, a very small image of the Egyptian goddess Isis, who is nursing her son, the god Horus. Now, when you're in the galleries, you'll notice the statue is in a case that is facing the paintings of Mary, so they'll be in dialogue. And they are very different scales, so I'm grateful to the Zoom world where we can compare them better. When you're in person, you'll be able to see that there's a gap between Horus and Isis so that you can see Isis's figure very well in the shape of her body. Now this figure of Isis, she is already a goddess. She's meant to be intimidating. She's wearing a headdress that has bull horns that are framing a sun disk so that nobody is in doubt of her authority. Robinson instead is depicting a Black Mary. So she is melding these traditions from music, from spirituals, from art to create her own version of what Mary would have been. And this painting is from 1978 when the civil rights movement is still happening. And as we know, it still has not, there's still ways to go, as Kevin eloquently spoke about earlier. But she is offering her Mary hope through the form of the spirituals, telling her not to weep, their salvation is at hand. Now, our next work will continue to express power, but we're now going to include animals in the mix. Next slide, please, Ian. Thank you. So here we have a bull that comes from the Nazca culture, which flourished in southern Peru between 100 BCE and 800 Common Era. Now, even though this is a very old work, it gives us clues about how it could have been used. So we'll notice that it has a rounded bottom. That would have let it sit very comfortably on the sand floors, on sand, in homes, in tombs, outside during rituals. You might also notice that it has a flared edge, and that indicates that it was available to multiple hands digging in at once. Now, what could it have contained? Perhaps hallucinogenic material, substances used in rituals where they're asking gods for water, for crops. Without water, there were no crops, and they would go and groups would battle each other. Let's take a look at the decoration more closely. So Annie, next slide, please. Thank you. I imposed squares so we could focus in on what are probably deities which combine features of cats and birds. So on the left, you'll see two diamond-shaped eyes, little black dots, and just under you see a mouth with whiskers. But on top of the head, those could be feathers. So this could be a combination of a bird and a cat. Now, Nazca art does not represent animals naturalistically. Instead, it's supposed to absorb the energy of the animals. And in particular, this deity could be a cat that swallowed a bird, and in that way imbued its power and is more powerful. It could be a deity particularly called cat demon, or it could be just a hybrid of a bird and a cat. Either way, it probably represents fertility. And now let's focus on the image on the right. You'll see that it has a string from its neck. So there are three of these deities represented around the bull. And it has a string, they each have strings around their neck on which hang what look to me to be sleeping little heads with eyes and mouths that are closed, but they're probably decapitated heads. So the Nazca warriors would wear shrunken heads to signal victories, and they would dress their deities in the same way. Groups would battle for dominance over land and water in the region. And cats, in particular, were symbols of agriculture because they would patrol the fields and keep it free from rodents. Likewise, they were symbols of fertility. Now, this is one of those objects, excuse me, that Kevin had mentioned before that has never been exhibited in the galleries and that we still have questions about. For example, what connections could there be between deities and everyday use of this object? Because we know that these objects would have been used in the household just as they would have been used in rituals or left in tombs. I'd like to thank WCMA interns Eva Daly and Claire Leroux for research support on this, and also to Beth Fisher, the postdoctoral fellow for digital humanities, Liz Gallerani, curator of Mellon academic programs, and Amber Orozco, WCMA intern, for the wonderful images of close-up images of this bowl, which were tricky to make. We'll move to the last example that I'll bring. It's the most abstracted. Next slide, please, Ian. Thank you. And in this case, ancestors become divine beings. So this comes from an area we now call Gabon, made by a Bakota maker, but we don't know the name. But we can identify it as a female because concave faces with bronze strips would indicate that this is a woman. We also notice the disc, the flat disc on her head and to the sides, which would indicate hair, and then the little spools would indicate earrings. Men would have convex faces and flat. No, they wouldn't have bronze strip decorations. They'd have flat decorations on their faces. Now, for the Bakotas, their religion was centered on their ancestors who were believed to wield power and control the well-being of their families long after they died. So their bones, the long bones, would be wrapped up and placed in baskets. And these figures would serve to either protect those baskets and or the family descendants. You notice now that we can see the diamond shape, the lozenge shape under the head, but that would have been covered. That would have placed it securely in the basket. So how would they have functioned? Well, notice it's small and portable. They would have carried these around with them. So instead of fighting other groups for dominance of land and water, they would have picked up and moved if they didn't have successful crops that year. And they could have taken their ancestral bones, which were the true relics, with them. And notice that the metal would have glimmered in a dark room, and it would have deflected evil. Excuse me. Now this figure itself, these reliquary figures that were protecting the bones, so reliquary is just holding a relic or something special that's historical. These are no longer invested with power because in around 1900, Christians went to Christianize the land, and as a symbol of their new beliefs, the Bakota people would destroy these, throw these reliquary figures in wells or bury them. And later, entrepreneurs, even missionaries, and the Bakota people themselves would dig them up and sell them to Western buyers. Museums purchased them, and there they inspired more art. So we hope that they might inspire your creativity and your musings as you are in the museum. I will now pass it on to Horace to share about more artworks.
Thank you so much for that incredibly rich and thoughtful analysis and pearls of wisdom and real kind of landing places for our attention, Elizabeth. I wanted to start here to think about the relationship between Heracles and Hercules. And earlier I mentioned about this broader understanding of trans identity across time, our own back into the ancient world, and to remember that trans identified individuals, as well as what we might term third gender or two-spirit individuals and various other contexts, have always been sacred to the divine. Heracles, whose name comes from Hera, was the child of Zeus, and in Hera's wrath, she created the first hero. Hero is also comes and etymologically derives from Hera's name. And in the moments when Heracles performed the 9 great labors, ridding the Attic world of quote unquote monsters, which have a really peculiar relationship to Northern Africa in really interesting ways, but more on that later. Um, Heracles is both a man and a goddess at the same time. This is such an important construct for an ancient way of thinking about an intermediary figure between humankind and the divine. Heracles inspired cults, and because of Hera's both anger but also great support of Heracles, we have this idea of an intermediary figure that then allows, then in the Christian world, an understanding of the intermediary role that both Jesus and Mary play to the divine. What's interesting is that in what's called the Pax Romana, or the Interpretatio Romana, the appropriation of Rome, Heracles becomes Hercules. And on the right of the screen, you see one of our wonderful fragments of a sarcophagi featuring in the triumph of Dionysus, the god Dionysus, another one of Zeus's children, becoming a god and going up to Mount Olympus. We see his older brother, now Hercules, in a much more geometric, a much more stoic, a bearded, and a much more muscular physique. Whereas in the ancient Attic world, particularly in Etruscan lands, Heracles is a lot more languid and a lot more androgynous, and has what's called a kind of up node or a top knot, a man bun, with the crown or a diadem, to say that he is both under the protection and the wrath of a goddess. And so I thought that this was a really interesting justification to see how, according to national ideology, Heracles becomes Hercules. Next slide, please. This incredible dance mask from the Fang Cultural Group, which spans across present-day Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, dates from, in our belief, present-day Cameroon. And it is carved from one solid piece of wood with white kaolin, this beautiful chalky substance, almost like a slip, found along the Kakongo River and other rivers that give it its complete white appearance. This mask would have been used in ritual. It would have been danced, it would have been performed, it would have been activated in a ceremony called a Nkingong, which NGO, diacritical mark, GOTANG. And this is often described as a masquerade twice a year in this cultural group, in which the divine comes down and also comes up from the river to commune, to be in congregation, to be in community with the people who are gathered. And in this kind of joint communion, something pretty extraordinary happens. Human beings are no longer in human time, they're in divine time. It is a temporal space and ritual set aside. And so now you start to see those themes, both of transcendence and of temporality, coming together in this incredible object. You know, one of the things that my colleagues and I thought about when we saw this mask was the great question of, had it been activated? Was it made for the export tourist trade, or was it made and taken from a community? And through incredible data imaging, and from our wonderful Brian Repetto, the head of our great preparatory team, we're able to look at the obverse and really drill down to look at the ghost of around the lips and around the eyes. And we realized that this mask was not consecrated. It was not performed. It would have been made by maker or makers who were making masks both for performance and for the tourist trade. Next slide, please. This subject is one that was a bit of a personal revelation to me. This is a prayer board of wood and ink from Sudan, and on it are inscribed on both sides passages from the Quran. And these prayer boards are used in two large contexts. In Islam, particularly in Shia Islam, which is one of the two branches of Islam. The other one is Sunni, that has that recognizes the kind of coterie of men who knew the Prophet Muhammad in life, recognizes them and their family as deities, as saints. Sufi Islam comes out of Shia Islam. And in Shia and Sufi Islam, there is a tradition of young children memorizing the verses of the Quran so much that by the time that they become 15, 16 years old, they are what's called a living Quran. They know the entire Quran by heart, and their entire lives are then dedicated to the Prophet. And these incredible prayer boards are used in madrasas to be able to kind of train one's eye with one's head, with one's heart, with the page, and to copy out perfectly the words and the verses of the Quran. They are also used by doctors in very devout communities that when a person is very sick and there is not one of these living Qurans, these living humans with the Quran memorized present, that writing out a healing verse, a mantra, a beloved passage from the Quran for the sick individual transforms that sick room, that hospital room, the bedside in a house, a couch, a table, into a place of prayer, into a sacred space. And once one is healed, the board is wiped clean. It's a really beautiful tradition that has both pedagogy and practical theology for the heart and for healing wrapped together. Next slide, please. Thank you so much, Annie. And I wanted to end here before turning it over to Kevin and hopefully going to a couple more of your questions. So please, if things are percolating, please drop them into the Q&A tab. But as Elizabeth and Kevin have already alluded so beautifully, we were really thinking non-hierarchically amongst ourselves and amongst the collection. We were really thinking about confluences that helped us reckon with the transitory nature of the moment and also helped us to see our collection in new ways, even as it was shifting. And we were also thinking about this broad, big idea that we use in art historical terms to discuss the confluence or the relationship or the correspondence between form and meaning. And that term is iconicity, from which the word icon comes from, that thing that is often pictorial, visual thus, and thus across cultures, across geographies, across time, is able to bring people into an understanding. And we thought about deeply the icons in our collection and even in the show, and none rose to the fore more than mothers and children. None rose to the fore more than the Virgin Mary. And of course, this incredibly powerful image by Delilah Montoya, El Guadalupano, of the Virgen de Guadalupe tattooed on the back of a prisoner. Our wonderful colleague in the art department at Williams, the amazing Ondine Chavoya, has written about this work and says the Virgen de Guadalupe on the back of, quote unquote, a prisoner to our eyes is the absolute confluence of saint and sinner, proximity to the divine, and those society holds at arm's length and at bay. And this image, which was originally made for an installation outside of Madrid, brings the Virgen of Guadalupe back to Europe to impose and to hold space and to counteract the colonial gaze that first brought the Virgin to the Americas. So I want to say thank you all so very much for joining us today and for allowing Elizabeth and I to take you through a couple of objects. And I'll now turn it back to my colleague, Kevin.
Thank you, Horace, and thank you, Elizabeth, for all of that great exegesis of those various objects. We're installing a very, very large Jenny Holzer in the next room, and what I mean very large is very large and very heavy. That's going to be in the Sweaty Concepts exhibition that Lisa Dorn will be talking about next week. So if you hear a lot of crashing, don't worry. It's just part of the construction process. Nothing's being damaged. So just to close, I wanted to kind of come back to the idea of transition and the idea of perpetual, and thinking a lot about how this exhibition is and the issues that we're delving into. It's just a beginning. It's, you know, this is going to be an iterative process. We have lots of work to do as an institution, as a culture, as a society, and we will do what we can with the 15,000 objects in our care. You will see over time that that objects will move in and out. Works on paper, will only have a certain amount of life that they can take light for, and then they have to go rest. So you will see things switch out. You will see different curatorial voices come in. Horace is transitioning to a new role as the Stebbins Curator of American Art at Harvard, which is amazing for him, and congratulations. But it also means that that we will, that other curatorial voices will be coming in and making their mark on this. So the exhibition itself is going to represent perpetual transition over time, and we invite you to come as soon as we open in the coming weeks. But then also I think this exhibition will reward coming back over and over again to see more of the collection and more and diverse voices in terms of who is speaking and what and which and how the objects are then speaking as well in this kind of collective or collaborative. So I will, in the last few minutes, just invite any final questions, and then we will adjourn.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I'd love to invite Horace and Elizabeth back on screen. We do already have a wonderful question from an audience member. And I would love to just invite, I think we'll take a few questions before we wrap up, but thank you all so much for those beautiful insights. It's a fantastic show, and we're so excited to be opening up the museum and the show to the public very soon. This is a question about something that you have touched on a little bit, but I think it's worth digging into even more. Someone asked, that you have talked about the effort that our museum is making in learning about the histories and contexts of non-Western objects. But this question was asking how the museum manages the uncertainties within those objects. So for example, how can we discern, maybe both as curators, but also as viewers of the exhibition, between the works whose titles and artists are not known versus those who are intentionally titled? And I think that's a wonderful question about curatorial and collection practices as well as interpretive ones. So I thought worth to maybe start there, and inviting others to also share questions too.
What comes to mind is not to even further complicate it, but to think about we also have anonymous donors to things, and figuring out when something is anonymous just because it was not recorded or it came in before records were kept, versus when an actual donor wanted to be anonymous, and what are the understandings of why someone would make an anonymous gift. But I would say this, and then my brilliant colleagues can jump in, is that I am of a belief that to do, in many ways, ethical curatorial work, we have to start from questions, and we have to start knowing that certain things are lost to us, certain things we may never know. And one of the benefits of being at an academic institution within an incredibly vibrant intellectual community and with such wonderful colleagues, one of them Elizabeth has already lifted up, or the wonderful Liz Gallerani, our curator of academic programs, is that Liz has long been engaging both curatorial, but also other of her colleagues across the country, as well as faculty, about when we don't know, what do we say? Is it unknown, unidentified, anonymous? And what we've come up with is often maker makers unidentified by WCMA, both to put the onus on us, but also to be very clear about what we do and do not know, so that when there are anonymous makers across traditions, we can clarify whether it was something that was never recorded, something that was taken, or something that perhaps the knowledge is now lost to us, and we have to sit and reckon with that loss.
I'll just add that these are conversations. Thank you, Horace, for saying that so succinctly and clearly. And these are conversations that are ongoing. And even the way we phrase, not known to WCMA may have recently changed. So we are continuing to think about how to present that to the wider public and to gather what they may bring.
Kevin, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was that. Horace and Elizabeth explained it much better than and more succinctly than I could. But it's just, yeah, it's really as Horace said, it's sort of I think we want the onus to be on us, and so moving away from things like anonymous, which suggests that it's like, oh, I don't know, to not identified by WCMA. Is something that we've wrestled with that over the past couple of years. And as Elizabeth said, I don't know that we're at the final form yet, but we feel very strongly about being transparent about what we do know and what we don't know. So to the original question, that's how someone will be able to come in and know what we know about an object and what we don't, because we will have that right on the label. It indicates what we know and what we don't.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap up in just a moment. I just wanted to ask maybe a kind of one final question of all of you. I'm curious, especially hearing you, Elizabeth, talk a bit about scale and sort of the opportunities that we've had today in this virtual convening. And also, Kevin, what you were saying earlier about sort of this kind of democratic curatorial treatment of objects, like from fragments to large and well-known artists, in our canon. I'm curious if there, as you were going through your process, if there were things that you wished you could have included, but couldn't, and what might have kept you from that. I wonder if that might just be a way to wrap us up before we head off.
I mean, one of the things that comes immediately to mind, I think, is the Delilah Montoya that Horace spoke about. So, so the image that was on the slide is a mixed media work that is huge and incredibly powerful, but was just way too large to sort of include it in the checklist. But she also made a smaller, not too small, but black and white photograph. So as part of as part of the project, as part of that whole work of art. So we're showing the photograph rather than the larger sort of mixed media collage work.
Oh, that's amazing. I didn't realize that. That's great. I don't know, Horace and Elizabeth, other things that are coming to mind for you?
Horace, feel free to jump in. I'll say briefly, I remember suggesting some coins, but Horace and Kevin are so experienced, and they said, well, it may not be fair to those coins if they're juxtaposed with objects, even small objects that are larger. So that there are different ways of displaying them, and they'll have their moment at some point.
I love that idea of objects having their moment, and I think that speaks to the theme of perpetual transition and ongoing work. Horace, any final words from you before we close out this wonderful time together? No, perfect. Well, I want to really thank you all so much for your amazing work on this exhibition. It's been a pleasure to watch it unfold, and I want to thank our audience today for being so engaged, for the wonderful questions and comments that we've been receiving from all of you in the chat. Thank you so much for all of this. I think the three of you have left us all so much to think about and look forward to. For those of you who are in the region, the museum is going to be opening to the public very soon, and this exhibition will be also coming up, so please stay tuned for more information on that from the museum. And if you aren't already subscribed to our newsletter, we'd love to have you so keep in touch with us. Thank you so much, and if for any of you interested, we'll be joining next week for a preview of our Sweaty Concepts exhibition here at noon on Zoom. So we look forward to that and to more soon. Take care, everybody.